Well, hello and welcome to the Media Roundtable. We're talking to leading voices in the podcast industry about what they create, why they create it, and the impact that they want it to have on the world. So whether you're a member of the media or the marketing community, or just a podcast listener who cares about the direction of this country and the messages you advance, we want you to feel good about what you consume, what you distribute, and what you support. I'm your host, Dan Granger. Today, we're joined by my friend and somebody that actually has been a very influential force in the advancement of the Media Roundtable, Mosheh Oinounou. Mosheh has an illustrious background as a journalist, and in some cases, he's willing to consult on initiatives that align with his passions and his expertise. But what I'm going to do, I want to talk through your bio with you before we kind of get into some of the core conversation, because number one, every time I read a bio that I think is accurate, somebody corrects me, and we're trying to cut down on misinformation in this show.
We are.
but I think you can probably provide some color commentary. I know that you were a reporter for 20 years and worked with a number of brands, particularly during the rise of, I think, the modern era of what we see as cable news. So can you just share a little bit about the first stage of your career and that background, and then we'll kind of move into some of the stuff you're working on now?
Sure. So I it's actually very interesting because from a very young age, I was interested in news and journalism, and I went to college in DC at George Washington University in what turns out was the peak year for the number of journalists in America, the year 2000. Mm-hmm. Since the year 2000, that number has gone down. Mm-hmm. And that was also the year where the internet really started to take the world by storm. Craigslist becomes a thing. Classified ads were a huge core component to newspapers, and the collapse of classified ads begin then. Anyway, needless to say, I still decided to pursue a career in journalism. And so the beginning of my career out of college, I got to start at Fox News Channel. And
by the way, hold on a minute. What year is this?
The year 2004.
2004. And when you say Fox News Channel, all kinds of associations, were those at play in 2004?
So what I like to say when it comes to Fox News Channel is Fox News Channel launches in October of 1996.
Yep.
We are now in the year 2022, which puts us at 26 years.
96.
I got into journalism because I was told there'd be no math, Dan. 26 years. And I kind of look at Fox in 4 different stages. Fox 2004 is a very different Fox. There's early Fox in the 90s, 9/11, really Fox finds its voice, finds its audience. Yeah. That is the first month that Fox surpasses CNN in the ratings, and they haven't looked back for 21 years, minus a couple moments, weeks here and there. I get to Fox. The job I have is with Chris Wallace at Fox News Sunday as his researcher. Chris Wallace spent many years in network news and was effectively an independent island at Fox, where he would bring on politicians on Sunday, Democrats, Republicans, critical of all of them. So I began my career at Fox, but at Fox News Sunday, we're among the folks in 2004, 05, 06, we were bringing on, and I was preparing interviews for, were Condoleezza Rice, Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, Colin Powell. The war in Iraq was going poorly. Katrina went poorly. Afghanistan was going poorly. And it was a time at Fox where Fox hosts had permission and were critical of Republican leadership, in particular on Fox News Sunday. And so I like to say that I got my start under someone who I think is one of the most fair people in journalism, asked hard questions of both sides, was one of the few outlets at Fox that most of, if any, of all Democrats were willing to come on. Mm-hmm. Terry McAuliffe, who would become governor of Virginia at the time, was working for the Clinton campaign, walked around the office one time at Fox and was like, I can't stand anyone here, but Chris Wallace, I'm willing to do you. And, Terry is a personality. Yeah. But it said something. So anyway, started out at Fox News Channel. I ended up covering the presidential campaign in 07, 08, was assigned to cover the Giuliani presidential campaign for 5 months.
He was a guest on the Media Roundtable this year.
Rudy Giuliani.
Well, at the 9/11 anniversary. Yeah.
And so Rudy Giuliani, riding the fame post 9/11, was in August of 2007, 45% of Republican primary voters were going to elect him president. And I was like, oh, this is great. I am going to cover the next president of the United States, or the next Republican nominee, at least I thought. That campaign would go south pretty quickly. And John,
why did that happen, by the way? I forgot.
Real briefly, Giuliani did not have a core constituency of the Republican Party. Giuliani was a mayor who was pretty moderate.
Yeah.
And at the time, the Republican Party, this primary voters are typically the most either progressive, they're the most diehard, or the most conservative.
Yep.
And McCain comes out of that. By the way, McCain, the conservatives were skeptical of as well. But the Giuliani campaign, he had a number of issues going for him, including no real strategy, no constituency in Iowa, no constituency among conservatives, and a work ethic, campaign work ethic that you could find lacking. And by that, I mean, McCain's doing 8 events a day and Giuliani was doing like an event every other day.
Okay.
But the obituaries of that campaign have been written long ago. Anyway, and then I got assigned to McCain, spent 9 months with John McCain, covering him for Fox News Channel, fascinating through the financial crisis of 2008, through the Sarah Palin selection. And
you were there
every day,
embedded. Wow.
For 9 months, traveling with him to 49 states, several countries, and watching. And by the way, McCain was known for being open with the press, having us on his bus for hours at a time, where he would just tell us stories about his time in Vietnam, tell us stories about his time in the U.S. Senate, tell us stories about getting drunk with Hillary Clinton in the Ukraine during Senate, trips over there. And so ultimately was a really incredible way to see the country, to learn about the state of our politics at the time, and to get an early indication of where the Republican Party was going with the selection of Sarah Palin. And we could talk about that for a while. So spend that. I covered Capitol Hill for a bit, finished my 5 years at Fox News, moved to Bloomberg Television in New York, where I ran foreign news coverage. That was the height of what we thought was the Great Recession and the biggest financial crisis of our time until COVID. And so got to cover foreign debt crises, the Fukushima nuclear meltdown, the BP oil spill, Davos, the World Economic Forum, the Dubai debt crisis, the Greek debt crisis, the Italian and Portuguese debt crisis, and managed coverage for Bloomberg Television, a financial products company that does a lot of journalism. They have an incredible wire service and probably one of the most incredible network of foreign reporters around the world. We had 2 bureaus in Nigeria, 4 bureaus in Brazil, dozens and dozens of reporters, because ultimately when they sell the financial terminal in these countries, they need to then provide those clients, banks, officials, government officials, information and news stories. So I was there when we were expanding to Mongolia for the first time. And we're like, oh, we're hiring 10 reporters in Mongolia. I was like, why? They're like, we just made a huge deal for banks in Mongolia and they want stories about Mongolia. So,
wow. And
they're like, so figure out what to do in Ulaanbaatar. Okay, great. So I was there for a couple of years and then followed a mentor of mine over to CBS News to help launch the CBS Morning Show. What would be, several dozen iterations in. CBS infamously, has never quite figured out morning television.
Yeah.
The Today Show has been around for, nearly almost since World War II. Good Morning America has been around for decades. Those have been number 1, number 2, going back and forth for decades in the ratings. And CBS had a show with Dick Van Dyke, had a morning show with Walter Cronkite. For a while, they got out of morning television and gave it over to Captain Kangaroo. And so there have been many iterations of CBS morning shows through the years. I came in 2012 to help launch the kind of serious news version of the morning show. And that sort of has been what they've continued to do over the course of the past decade. Found some success there. Went over to launch the first streaming digital 24-hour channel, CBS. CBS, we talked about cable news. CNN had cable news. Fox got into cable news. NBC got into cable news in the 90s. CBS never, for a variety of reasons, didn't get into that game. Mid-teens, we still need a 24-hour outlet, but let's do it on digital. So help launch what was called CBSN, and now I think they're calling it the CBS News Streaming Network. And how do we take 60 Minutes and all of our various programs and turn it into 24-hour news coverage? Ran that for a couple of years, and then was asked to come run the CBS Evening News.
Hold on a second. I want to hear about the streaming part.
Yeah.
What year are we talking that they launched?
2014.
Yeah. So what was it like launching a streaming platform in 2014 versus, everything we've seen in the last few years?
What's very interesting is we finally had the timing right, because there were a number of organizations that tried to do streaming before 2014, but given the nature of where the internet networks were, where smartphones were, video streaming, it wasn't quite there. And, you'll hear these stories that, Jack Dorsey tried to launch a version of Twitter several years before he ended up launching it, and just the technology and the consumer and the products just weren't there for it. So when it comes to streaming, 2014 happened to be a year where I still had to Google what Roku was. What's this Roku? Apple TV, they still hadn't quite figured that out. You didn't have access to the App Store yet, but we did understand that launching a cable network in 2014 didn't make sense. that we already saw the cable, the people cutting the cord. So what we had to do was figure out the platforms and figure out how to build for these platforms. So Samsung smart televisions, Amazon Fire Stick, Roku, Apple TV. And so there was a lot of, it felt like the Tower of Babel where we all spoke different languages. Yes. I had to have the engineering team in, have the editorial team in. How do we take the content? How do we then figure out how to distribute it? How do we build a back-end technology for it? How do we figure out ad placement and ad insertion? Because the idea was we were going to be free, one touch in your phone, on your computer, without having to have a subscription. That was going to be the comparative advantage. And it actually helped us a lot because we didn't have a cable property. Like if you try to stream a cable network, you need to put in your username and password for your cable provider. And CBS didn't have that. We could launch fresh direct to digital without having that infrastructure and that legacy, which was challenging and helpful in some ways. So there it was very much like, okay, HuffPost had experimented with HuffPost Live, ABC had experimented. What did they get right? What did they get wrong? And what is the core product we can provide for folks? And what are the things that people hate about cable news and 24-hour news? This is still 2014. And it's like, well, they don't like the commentary. They don't like the politics. And CBS, we're going to just give them the facts and give them a reporting. And also we have this incredible international infrastructure at CBS. We have a 2-hour morning show, a half-hour evening newscast, a Sunday morning show, and 60 Minutes. So you have this entire infrastructure and no outlet for all of the content. Wow. So now we have a platform to put all that content. How are we organizing it? How are people using it? So what was incredible about it is we're going to try some stuff and see how it goes. And what we found very quickly upon launch is I think within weeks of launch, we had the situation in Ferguson, Missouri, the riots of Ferguson, Missouri. We had, I think there was a terror attack in France. There was a terror attack in Sydney, Australia. Mm-hmm. And we discovered that people came for breaking news and stayed. We also discovered that your mobile consumer was watching for a few minutes, your desktop was watching for more, but your over-the-top viewer watching on a streaming platform like Roku or Apple TV was putting it on and leaving it on for hours, which is great when you have several commercial breaks an hour. And so we started to think about, we were so oriented like, well, what about the mobile experience? Like how do we accommodate everyone? And you find out that like, if your biggest viewer and your best case is streaming on big televisions, then we need to start to build around that and then build around the use case, which is you can build beautiful feature shows and spend a lot of money on talent and content, but what the people want, the core product they want is the latest news and they want straightforward facts. And
you're saying at that time, that's not what the market wants today.
Well,
so it seems.
Well, yeah, I mean, we can discuss how the market's evolved since then, but ultimately we were basically first movers in the marketplace. Yeah. At the time, CNN was playing with something called Great Big Story, which again, they were investing in kind of featurey, big productions. And we're like, we have a live feed right now of a fire happening in California. We have a live feed right now of a press conference somewhere. I mean, it was effectively, if people are familiar with NFL Red Zone, it was like Red Zone for news, let's bounce around between things. And we have 200 local CBS affiliates. Yeah. Like we dabbled in car chases a couple times. We were experimenting and it was a lot of fun and really interesting. And what was incredible is coming from network television where I get Nielsen ratings, and the Nielsen ratings come a week later in my minute by minutes. I'm getting immediate, within an hour, I'm getting my streaming data of what people are clicking on, how they're clicking, what they're staying on. And so this avalanche of data is coming to us and we're very quickly able to pivot. We're like, guess what? We did a whole bunch of stuff this morning and the story that people most cared about was X. Does that work with our brand? Can we provide them more? What are the questions people are asking us on Twitter? And we're starting to have a dialogue with the audience that still isn't happening when it comes to traditional media.
So I want to jump to more of what you're working on today, but let's go back to the start because we were talking earlier before we started recording about your time at CNN.
Correct. I am a campus intern volunteer. CNN Crossfire happens to be taping on GW's campus in 2003, 2004. They brought it to campus for a live audience. Mm-hmm. And it was fascinating. So you are, at that point, CNN is over 20 years old. CNN launches in 1980. Crossfire is their big political debate show. Yep. They decide it'll be more entertaining and compelling with a live audience where, students are asking questions, et cetera. We're on a campus, it's very dynamic. At the time, if you recall, Chris Matthews Hardball was doing campus tours. Yep. And it was a way to kind of inject energy into television shows. CNN happens to be located in DC, so they bring it to campus. And what we were talking about earlier over breakfast was the episode that basically brings down the show. They invite Jon Stewart, who is he is going after CNN on a nearly daily basis on the Daily Show. This really kind of Jon Stewart finds his voice around then. This is kind of post 9/11 Iraq War. Yeah. Stewart's going, and Stewart becomes, one of the leading voices when it comes to political commentary. And so he's going after CNN. They invite him on Crossfire, like, hey, let's have Jon Stewart on to talk about politics and his take on things. And famously, this is before YouTube. And it was hard to have viral moments back then. People were like take for granted now you have YouTube. Before 2006, there was no YouTube. Like you had to go to these random video sites and maybe find a digital video. And there was no video on mobile at the time. And so he goes on a rant on Crossfire and effectively tells the hosts at the time, Tucker Carlson and Paul Begala, they're destroying America through this debate that they're having. CNN is turning politics into entertainment, and they're doing a disservice to the country. I think it was within days that John Klein, the president of CNN, agrees with Jon Stewart over his own show and cancels the show. And it's remarkable that, we were saying, like, I'd love to watch an old episode of Crossfire today and look at it compared to where our...
You'd say, now that's journalism. Two sides to a story, right?
Two sides to a story. The idea that you have liberals and conservatives on, that Republicans and Democrats come on. We would look at it today and be like, wow, was that PBS?
Well, it's interesting that it was Jon Stewart making that comment, because what was the Daily Show's job? To turn politics into entertainment, right? So maybe he wasn't in the best place to do that, but it was a kind of a profound and prophetic statement to make.
Oh, totally. And I think part of what he said was, I'm a comedian.
Yeah.
Like, it is my job. Like, I do entertainment. That's what I do. You're CNN. You have a higher responsibility to the country, to facts, etc. Like, I can mock things, like, and I think he made reference to like movies he's been in, etc. Like, like, I'm a comedian who's been in X shows, like, but at CNN, you guys should be doing better than this. And what was remarkable is that CNN effectively acknowledged Jon Stewart's argument to the point where they canceled that show.
For how long did they acknowledge that?
Well, what's very interesting is if you look at the evolution of cable news, is CNN for a very long time, CNN makes their name in 1991 with the Persian Gulf War and the war in Iraq, being on the front lines, a young Wolf Blitzer, a young Christian Amanpour. And that was the first war that we really watched in real time. And we speak now, obviously, as the events unfold in Ukraine. And that was core to CNN's mission. And then ultimately, over time, as the cable audience diminished and as the cable audience aged, and as more media outlets, the internet becomes a thing, and mobile news becomes a thing, and websites become a thing, well, CNN has less of an audience. And what does that audience want? Well, more and more what they find is they come, if you're on the right, you go to Fox. Starting in the mid 2000s with Keith Olbermann and then Rachel Maddow, if you're on the left, you go to MSNBC. Well, what's CNN left with? Well, CNN's left with their core competency, which is breaking news. Breaking news doesn't happen every day. So what are you doing for weeks or months when no major story is happening? How do you attract an audience? And by the way, I remember looking at the ratings data at Fox, and our core audience at Fox would watch 3 to 4 hours a day of Fox News. Yeah. The average CNN viewer was like 11 minutes. So what you see is a major shift. One of the things I remember looking at Fox was the ratings data. The average Fox viewer watched for 3 to 4 hours a day. The average CNN viewer watched for between 10 and 12 minutes a day. Well, if you're running a business, that's an issue. How do you get people to spend more time with you? And so what you saw in the evolution in the past decade, really in the teens, is CNN finally going in the direction that they already saw Fox and MS go, especially in prime time, where they're like, well, in prime time, we can do opinion. And then inevitably that opinion and that commentary will leak in to the ethos, to the DNA, and start being apparent in every hour. And that's a challenge to kind of keep up that wall between, like, we do commentary in this hour. And the idea behind all of it was newspapers, where you have an opinion section and you have a news section, that we keep those things apart. But as we know, things tend to bleed. People tend to their colleagues. And so, and in this case, they found that they could hold an audience longer if they do some more opinion and less straight news.
Cheaper to manufacture, holds the attention.
1,000%.
So looking at the state of media in 2022, we've seen a lot of things change in the last 24 months. I don't even know how to define where we are with the pandemic. I don't know if anybody like has consensus on what stage we're actually in. But the media's changed, the world's changed, the changeover from Trump to Biden has been significant. What is the state of media today?
So there's a few things to be watching because, as we know, new technologies are coming on board, new platforms, and everyone's trying to figure out, especially if you're a legacy media institution, how to survive and how to adapt to the new world. A few things. One, on the television side, cord cutting continues. People going to digital streaming outlets, et cetera. We talked about 2014 when CBS was kind of early riser there. At this stage of the game, everyone has a streaming platform, and it either ends with a max or a plus. I discovered today with my FiOS package that I have AMC Plus. I was like, oh, AMC has a stream. Like, I should check that out. And where are we? So cord cutting continues. The cable bundle is dying. There's still money there though. And you have huge companies like Viacom figuring out, what do I do with 24 cable channels? Who have tried to build streaming platforms for. Everyone's built a streaming platform, and now they're all competing for consumers' money and attention. Ultimately, depending on who you believe, it's like the average consumer will subscribe to 1 to 2 of the Netflix, Disney Plus, Hulu, Paramount Plus, Peacock, etc. And then you got the AVOD platforms, Tubi, which was bought by Fox, and some of the others. Then you have the newspaper industry, where local news, there's been a collapse. There's entire areas of this country you refer to as news deserts that they couldn't make it work. Huge conglomerates like Gannett and Nexstar. Nexstar in particular owns a lot of TV stations. Gannett owns some TV, but Gannett owns 100 plus newspapers. These are newspapers that once had entire editorial staffs and dozens of reporters. And now you go to some small town America and the newspaper is 2 people.
We had somebody on who is managing an initiative, Protect Our Press, and trying to encourage the advertising community to recognize the importance of local news and to actually start allocating, part of their ad spend to it. But then you see groups like Axios that are actually going in and creating, national companies going and creating regional coverage. Is it just going to get replaced? Is it more a question of who's going to start providing it and we're just in the middle of that? Or is it actually going to die? Is it actually possible to see that go away?
Local news.
Yes, local news.
I hope not, for the sake of truth and people getting basic coverage they deserve. I mean, local news, we forget, is like where there's accountability for the local mayor, for the company that's polluting on the corner.
But if the business model has to change, you're saying the old business model is
broken.
Not
Classified ads.
It's like yellow pages, effectively, right?
Correct.
So what? Like, it seems like the demand that got it there in the first place, I can't imagine is left for the reasons you're citing. But what is the way forward? And are there not people coming in to kind of reinvent?
And there's been several attempts on reinventing. AOL had a thing they invested in called Catch.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, no, it's funny. I begin any sentence with AOL had a thing. You're like,
oh, that's where we're at. Okay.
No, I think that one of the core things is we talk about when we answer your question, what is the state of the media? It's a lot about subscriptions right now.
Yeah.
You're not going to get paid for the ads you were on the traditional platforms. What we could sell a 30-second ad for in the evening news, to make that sort of money on YouTube, you need to be having tens of millions of views on a video, maybe.
You mean through their affiliate payouts, the AdSense model?
Exactly. I mean, depending on what your CPMs are on your website, you might be able to do well. You might be able to get some sponsorships, but ultimately, for a lot of media organizations, you're never going to have the amount of reach and clicks that you need to make up for existing ad revenue. Mm-hmm. So subscription is key. Finding consumers, giving them a product that they're willing to pay monthly for, and to start to develop recurring revenue around.
All right, let's talk about that for a second. I think it's a fascinating topic because I think there's a danger if the good journalism is all behind a paywall.
Yes.
Because most people can't afford the paywall. And if quality news and journalism is only withheld for the most privileged classes, we've got a real problem in this country. And it just means things like misinformation are going to be more rampant. Do you see the future as a as a situation where most people are getting news from sources they pay a subscription for versus an advertising model? Do you see it as a hybrid? Where do you think that's going to shake out?
I think for the sake of, a fully informed country and world, you need some sort of hybrid. I was doing some work for a company in Colombia, and they were talking about, that the majority of the media there is 90-something% ad supported. And a lot of people get their news via WhatsApp threads. There's different models kind of developing around the world. But what's core to this is, for most constituencies, like who, don't have the budget, don't have a news budget per se, they deserve good information, and they deserve the facts, and they want good information. But subscribing, and paying monthly to the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post, where, by the way, we're talking about the importance of local news. A lot of these stories to them are not relevant to their lives. Yeah. So having local, ad supported or some other way, maybe it's a nonprofit model in some cases, local news and national news that people can access is key, because guess what's free on Facebook? Misinformation and fake websites and, questionable content. The good content, like, you're going to hit that paywall on that third story on the Wall Street Journal or that third story on Bloomberg. And we're going to pay for that in this country when we don't have a basic set of facts, an agreed upon set of facts. I love the quote from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, or at least he gets credit for it, former New York senator, who said, "You're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts." And now we live in a world where everyone chooses their own facts, partially intentionally and partially just because these are the information sources available to them.
Yeah. So, I think a lot of people have talked about, was it the movie Broadcast? Which one was it in the 70s?
Yeah, Broadcast.
Foretold. Yeah. So I think, we've kind of seen that, and it's like, look at how much we're moving in that direction, to where news is just chaos. It is nothing but entertainment. And I think I'm hopeful that we saw the peak of that in the last few years, and that now the pendulum's going to swing back. But I don't know. Do we just keep spiraling out forever? And I want to get into how this impacts like real world consequences. But yeah, we definitely see the degradation of trust in institutions, right? And if you can't trust your press, and you can't trust your politicians, and any real authority structure is doubted, what happened, how defensible are we as a country?
Well, I mean, one of the issues we have is that media is for profit.
Yeah.
And to make a profit when it comes to ads in the digital ad environment, you need clicks. And so we've created an incentive structure where the more clicks you get, the more revenue you get. Well, how are you going to get those clicks? Well, you got to be provocative with your headline, potentially misleading with your headline. That's an issue. On top of that, distribution mechanisms, social media. So distributing your news via Facebook in particular, and a number of these platforms, they're algorithmic. They're rewarding consumers based on stories that they're clicking on and giving them like stories. And so you then end up creating this warped situation where the media is like, well, what were the most clicked on stories? Let's do more of those. And then, you get more extreme and more extreme and more extreme, and you're not effectively informing people. You're not serving one of your core missions, which is providing citizens with information about their world around them in a fair way, and giving them all the content they need. You're serving them the content that is getting you the most clicks that people are choosing. And ultimately, when you do surveys of people, they're like, oh yeah, I want more news on international relations, and I want more news.
But they don't.
They don't. They do. I don't know. I'm split on these things, because I have found that people really do want good information, but they will lie to pollsters about, the type of content
it's a question of like, I'm in advertising, right? And so I'm always suspect of focus groups, because it's a bunch of people talking about what they think they're going to do.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily correlate with what they do. And so, in some respects, I'm sure all of us would say, yes, we want objective journalism. We want it balanced. We want it global. We want all that. But at the end of the day, like if I get home at the end of the day and I'm hungry, I'm not going to cook something healthy necessarily. I'm going to go for what's the low hanging fruit. And that's what we do in our lives, right? Yeah. And when you have so many choices, you can have anything you want to eat anytime, We don't wait for anything. Why would you not just, we're like accelerating hedonism on every level, including our consumption of information.
It reminds me of the several years that I subscribed to The Economist.
Yeah.
You get The Economist because you're like, I want to read The
You're supposed
Economist.
to get The Economist.
You're supposed to get The Economist. You want to read The Economist. You're like, you know what? This is a really
You don't read The Economist?
This is an interesting story about the state of the Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. I'm going to get to that this weekend.
Yeah.
No, I'm not getting that. I'm never getting that, but I like having The Economist on my table, at least for a while when we're getting print magazines. Whether to answer your question, it's hard to say, right? Because at the same time, you could say that, Jeff Bezos, for all of his flaws, his injection of funds into the Washington Post has saved a newspaper that was really on fumes in the early teens. And help build new revenue models for them. And having a strong Washington Post is important. It's accountability for our government, right? It's the biggest newspaper and the seat of the most powerful government in the world. And you've seen that a little bit with kind of benevolent billionaires, right? Whether it's Carlos Slim in the New York Times, whether it's Murdoch in the Wall Street Journal. And again, we could have a whole discussion about that and then the perils of that and the pluses of that, et cetera. But I will say that ultimately, if we don't change the incentive structure around how media can be profitable and grow, ultimately they have shareholders. Some of them are publicly traded. Well, their shareholders want to see growth. How do you see growth? More numbers. How do you see more numbers? Well, you keep feeding the content or creating content for people, that they want.
So the whole thing is a losing proposition.
It'll be challenged to cut that cycle. And then we have the situation of the last 4 years of the Trump administration, which was just, the man was, I ran the CBS Evening News for a couple of years, and I used to have to keep several minutes a day until an hour before the show open for the Trump story or stories of the day. And we, around 5 o'clock every day, would be like, okay, White House, what do you got? They're like, there's 1 of 4 stories we could do today because he's making headlines on this, he's making headlines on this. And just to give folks perspective, typically White Houses until Trump and since then will pick a story or a theme of the day they want to go with, or a story will happen. In the Trump administration's case, multiple stories were happening, sometimes unbeknownst to his own staff, because he's tweeting something. And we're like, okay, there's a crisis with the EU, there's an issue on Capitol Hill, he's picked a fight with the CEO, and something else is happening. Well, the media was like trying to cover all of that and getting an incredible amount of, in some cases, subscribers, clicks in general, and then Trump loses. And we now have the last year where typically you do see a downtrend in interest and clicks in news in non-election years. This was particularly significant because of the nature of 2020 and the nature of the Trump administration. I mean, you can go days now with not knowing what's happening at the White House.
Do you think that many professional journalists hate him, but also wish he would run again?
Donald Trump?
Yes.
I will say this. Trump would say on the campaign stop often that I don't understand why the media doesn't give me, better coverage. I'm their best friend. To a certain extent, he was right.
Yeah.
Right? Like the amount of subscribers, the New York Times, the Atlantic, a number of the Washington Post got because of the coverage of the Trump administration and covering those things. Like he did the cable news ratings the last 4 years. One of the reasons that some of them are pushing towards streaming now and didn't focus on it for 4 years is because they were living on the high of the Trump administration.
Yeah.
There's a famous quote from the former CBS CEO, Les Moonves, who said, I think Trump's reelection would be bad for the country, but good for news.
Yeah.
Something to that effect.
Well, there's no question, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we live in an attention economy. It keeps, that the currency of attention keeps getting more and more valuable. And here's a candidate who's a modern day P.T. Barnum.
Oh, he's a master marketer.
So it feels like the structure that we have in place, even though all cultural institutions are pretty unanimously lined up against Trump, he also is feeding them. He's putting food on their table. And so can they resist? Would they be able to not give him the same share of coverage this cycle that they have,
And by the way, one would say when things are down in the last year, who's still getting a lot of coverage? There are some weeks you might turn on a certain cable news network. And I'm not talking about Fox, I'm talking about like MSNBC or CNN, and you might see more coverage of Trump in something he said in a podcast interview or something that, is rumored about at Mar-a-Lago than what's happening at the White House.
So that's not promising. what we're talking about. I mean, it really, if you think about, just zoom out for a minute and you think about, we've had a good thing going in this country, or many of us have, and we no longer trust each other, and we no longer have common understandings of things that link us together. And how can we protect ourselves from existential threats, whether that is climate or whether that is China, or anybody that could in the future undermine our way of life? How do you do that when all we're doing is spending all of our time? It's like your house is getting robbed, and but the kids are still wrestling in the living room, and it's like, when do we stop that so that we can actually pay attention to the things that are really important? And I think because we work in media, it feels like media is one of the main contributing factors here. I don't know if that's bias from me or not, but what do you think? How big of a factor is media?
I mean, I think you can't take media in isolation. Media, the news media is covering our politics.
Yeah.
Our politics through gerrymandering, through various. Have you seen various trend lines where the parties have started to come apart further? You've seen less competitive races. You've seen now blue staters moving to people with like-minded liberal ideas, and red, people with more conservative moving to redder areas. And so like you had a much more purple map 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. You also now have, because of the nature of media and the internet, more outlets for people to go to. So they can live in their filter bubbles on social media, et cetera. And so it's not like we all turn on, it was our struggle with CBS News when I was running Evening News. I was 75 years old. And there was a time where that show used to have 60, 70 million Americans were watching Walter Cronkite. Yeah. And now you have 6 or 7 million, which is still something, but not what it was. And I think that we have a challenge in the media to be more responsible. At the same time, we have shareholders in a lot of those media companies, and that ultimately the media reflects where the country is. You can't blame, well, the media pulled this country apart. Well, the media is also reflective of our politics and our business. And
I mean, to some extent, the same thing is true about our politicians. We got what we asked for.
Absolutely.
Right. And we keep doing that. But that being said, I think, and we've talked a lot about this in the past, just in kind of the formation of the show. And our only hope, I think, that we have come to, and thinking that there may be a way to walk this back, is, like you said, changing the incentive structure. Because you have corporations that are now, looking at ESG, social good, and saying, okay, we are going to stand for principles. We're going to live those out through our supply chains, through what we sponsor, through things like that. If they mean it, we might be able to have a strong enough movement to start to walk some of these back. But if they don't, and if the idea of stakeholder capitalism is just, lip service, and it's really still shareholder capitalism, period, then we're dead, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and what you're bringing up there is that there's two big parties here that have a responsibility and have a lot of power. One is the consumers, who vote with their remote controls, or their, whatever they're clicking on, or their podcasts, or their, mice. And then you have the advertisers. And if the advertisers demand a certain amount of responsibility, if the advertisers who buy ads on the cable news networks, or who buy ads from various institutions and demand things, then they wield a lot of power over these institutions.
So, which brings us to you today, because I see, and we've had some people on this show, we just had Barry Weiss a few weeks back, and I think there are a number of journalists that are saying they're rejecting fringe orthodoxy and willing to challenge their own side and perspective. And it seems like you're part of a really meaningful movement that is actually catering to the even-handed, open-minded news consumer. Can you talk about what you've created and what your latest initiatives are?
Sure. And so, one of the things you bring up takes me back to your first question, which is, tell me about the state of the media.
Yeah.
Well, one of the big trends is the creator economy.
Yeah.
That now, because of the platforms that exist, whether it's Substack or other competitors for newsletters, podcasts, social media, that you can create an individual brand. And that comes at the same time that consumers out there no longer trust the big brands, but they want individuals. They want influencers, if you will. That even you see this in the advertising industry, that a general ad for somebody might not work, but getting some celebrity on their Instagram account to endorse you, or self-made influencer, has a much higher ROI. So again, it evolved here because basically height of COVID 2 years ago, I start to see misinformation getting out there. I try to quash a bunch of it on Instagram. And you asked me earlier, why Instagram? Well, Twitter seemed saturated to me. And at the time, just Instagram seemed like a natural place. Instagram has a feature called Stories, which is the focus of what I do, where it's one of the few places left in social media where you can tell a chronological story, not algorithmic. This happened, then this happened, and this happened. As a consumer, you can go in order. My wife says, you got to keep this up. Like, this is a useful tool for people. And initially it was just kind of like, I'm watching Cuomo briefings, I'm watching Fauci briefings. The world feels like it's falling apart in March 2020. And I'm just trying to help friends and family. And then suddenly I start to see strangers who are following me. And it gets 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000. What is happening here? Well, people are like, well, this serves a purpose. This is what I need. And honestly, for me, I'm a news junkie. And I thought, I just want to help, people that I know. And then suddenly within a couple of weeks, I'm hearing from nurses at a hospital. I'm hearing from a mass distributor in China. How do I help that person? And I'm posting their messages. I verify where they work. I want to ensure that I'm not contributing to misinformation. In fact, I'm trying to fight it. And over time, whether it be that, then you had the Black Lives Matter protests, you had the election, January 6th, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine. People want good information, that they can be informed, that they can talk about with their families. And I have found a very politically diverse, geographically diverse audience globally who have now decided to turn to Instagram for their news. And what I try to do on a daily basis is just give people good information about the stories they need to know.
How many times a week are you posting? I know you're posting all day, every day, but you kind of have your updates. So if you could get your most of your news through your feed, I believe, but then you've got these longer form episodes that you do.
Sure. So, I've tried to utilize various tools that Instagram has kind of evolved over time. And the big thing I use is stories, and I'll probably put out 40 to 50 stories a day. So we're looking at upwards of 300 stories I'm putting out a week. Mm-hmm. I'll do a weekly Q&A with the community on Monday nights, where I'll solicit their questions and, ask me, what do you want to know about the Canadian truckers? What do you know? And I'll try to get those questions in advance so I can research them. I'll try to be honest with the audience, which is a huge thing for trust. I don't know the answer to that question. Is an answer that I'll use, right? Mm-hmm. I don't pretend to know stuff. Mm-hmm. I try to bring some calmness to it. I try to ensure that I'm not just bringing click-baity headlines, but no, that was a fear-mongering headline. That was unnecessary. That was, the institutions aren't covering this well. And frankly, as you talked about, are we out of it? Well, you saw during COVID that suddenly every negative headline about that this next variant is going to kill everyone is getting a lot of attention. And, they even what do they call it? Flu-rona? Mm-hmm. All the media went nuts because of one lady in Israel had the flu and COVID at the same time. And they're like, should we fear flu-rona? Yeah. And I'm like, no, someone had it at the same time. Yeah. And
700 million people saw that headline and had to ask themselves that question for no reason.
And I get why they do, but it just really disappointed me, because this was a real opportunity for the media to serve a purpose. And I feel like the media comes out a loser out of COVID.
So in the last couple of years, you started this Instagram channel, and the name of the Instagram channel is
just my first name, @Mosheh, Mosheh.
Mosheh.
Yes.
Just so you know. Okay. And as you've done that, you have how many followers now?
200,000.
And so I'm going to say back something you told me earlier, which is that you haven't spent $1 on marketing.
No.
And you've been putting stuff out onto Instagram, and the marketplace has been rewarding you by sharing it. And what you're doing is deliberately not clickbaity.
Yeah.
It is not sensationalistic. And you're not even on your soapbox telling everybody what they should think and what they should do.
I try my best to just say,
this is good news.
I'm trying to be a good news story in a bad news media environment. And luckily, the audience has responded well. There's people, I'll often run into people in the street who will recognize me now from Monday nights. And I'll be like, how did you find me? And they're like, I don't even know. Someone sent me the thing and I got addicted to your feed. And I really like what you're doing there. And thankfully, that has now allowed me to expand to a newsletter that launched last week, Mo News, on Bulletin. And so you can find that several times a week now. And I'm trying to build beyond the Instagram platform.
Yeah. Well, so I guess bottom line, we talked about kind of the macro issue and how it, creates real threats to our country, our way of life, our civilization. But maybe what you're doing actually is the answer. And not that you can do that all yourself, but I think it represents a market demand that's very, very important. We can't change the course of getting sucked into the abyss of just chasing attention at the expense of our own, happiness. We can't do that if there's no model that supports. If you can't grow just trying to do good news, we're never going to get out of this. So it's very, very encouraging to me. And when I've been able to watch and listen to what you're doing, I agree with what you're saying. It's not, you haven't invested in a big, and I hope you do someday, but you don't have a big studio and a big production. But what you do have is information that is credible, that is calming. And I don't know what you think about the topic necessarily when I hear you, but it helps me to understand what I think. You're actually giving information and context to things that very few people are. I looked at Ukraine, which, this will come out probably a week after Russia invaded Ukraine. And I turned on the TV when I saw my newsletters telling me what happened overnight. So I turned on the TV and I turned on everything but cable news. And it was another day at the office.
Yeah.
It was feel good stories. It was like very don't look up. And then I turned on cable news and both sides, instead of talking about the problem and, what are the options, they were talking about, can you believe that the Republicans are criticizing the president right now? And can you believe that the Democrats are managing this so poorly? It's like, we can't do anything.
Everything is through the lens of the last 4 years. Everything is through domestic politics. Yeah. And guess what? The world's a complex place. When you look at the Ukraine-Russia issue, you're looking at 1,000+ years of history. And to view it through 2022 domestic American politics does a disservice to the audience and doesn't help them understand what's going on. And people are like, wait, why do some people pronounce it Kyiv versus Kiev? Mm-hmm. What is this? Why does Putin want to invade? What is NATO and why is it still relevant? None of those questions are being answered by the traditional media outlets. And, sometimes they are, and I'll try to find the articles that are answering those questions, but they're definitely not leading the websites or leading cable news coverage. And that's concerning because what I have found through Instagram, through these platforms, is that people are dying for good information and it is so hard to find. And they will forward me a screenshot of a Facebook post they got from a family member. And they're like, is this true? And I'm like, literally, this is Russian propaganda. They're like, oh, but it has a news site. I'm like, have you heard of that news site before? It's a made up site. They're like, oh, thank you. And by the way, treat them as an equal. There's no stupid questions. And I think that's a tendency among some elite folks in the media to condemn these people. Can you believe what people are clicking on? Yeah. Well, yeah, I can actually. It's a really complex thing to find good information these days.
Well, and so I think your model is very important. I think you're doing excellent work. I'm learning a lot from listening to it. And it seems like you may be part of a movement that shows the power of curation right now and how the value of somebody that can filter for you is everything, and maybe provide a little context, which you're doing as well. So thank you for what you're doing. I think it's an important work. And, I'd love to work with you on stuff when I didn't know that you were going to go out there and build your own media channel. But now that you are, I hope that more people can get involved and that we can be a part of that. Are you accepting sponsors?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. I've started to, it's so interesting because this began and still is out of my living room as just I wanted to provide a service, and this service has turned into a business. And I've started to get now several dozen sponsorships for ads on the Instagram feed. And it's a tricky thing, right? Because I'm not a simple sponsorship among, my content is not just happy content, right? Ultimately, it's a news feed. I'm giving information. So I've had some sponsors who are like, can you please not cover a war within 24 hours of posting our ad? I was like, I'll try to do my best. And I hope the rest of the world,
not to create a war.
I'll hope that Vladimir Putin can cooperate with the time that I'm posting your ad. But I hear you.
Okay. Final plugs, ways people can get in touch with you.
First and foremost, if you're on Instagram, follow me on Instagram at Mosheh. I have the new newsletter, Mo News, monews.bulletin.com. Those are the two main platforms. I have taken on Patreon, where people can support what we're doing too. I mean, I try to remind folks, one of the reasons we worked previously together is I consult full time. This news thing was a hobby turned service turned business. And so I'm hoping to continue to build that out in a significant way. And so the way I could do that is, through people who can support that. And I think the next thing, soon enough, Dan, I'll hopefully be launching a podcast and have you on.
Very
talk
good.
about this further.
I'm ready. Well, thank you for everything you're doing. This was a great conversation. And as always, this show is dedicated to advancing our mission of mobilizing marketers for truth and civility in journalism. We value truth, fairness, clarity, respect, de-escalation, and tolerance. And we invite you to connect with us at MediaRoundtable.com. And if you found the show helpful and you're committed to our cause, please follow us on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, maybe even Instagram, or wherever you like to listen. It's always free. And if you're a marketer looking for support, you can get in touch with our ad agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. Is that enough things for you to subscribe to? Special thanks to Bianca, Kyle, Jennifer, Amy, and the team at Podcast One. And as always, influence responsibly.